Hello, and welcome to this evening's edition of Scotland at 7. My name's Ruth Watson. My guest this evening is Richard Thomson, SNP MP for Gordon. Hi, Richard. Thanks for joining us.
Hi there.
So I'll go through the news headlines and the Ukraine update, and then we'll come to you to get your views on the news of the day. The Ukraine update. The US congressional delaying of fresh military aid for Ukraine is already having an impact on the battlefield, NATO's Secretary General has warned. Going to Israel now, 112 Palestinians have been killed and 157 were injured in Israeli strikes in the past 24 hours, said the Gaza Health Ministry. The SNP has written to Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer, urging them to find the courage to do the only right thing by voting for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Sir Keir Starmer has hailed Labour's fantastic results in the Kingswood and Wellingborough by-elections after the party secured 2 victories. Anas Sarwar has used his speech at the Scottish Labour conference to say that Labour Party was the change Scotland needed. The NatWest has made its biggest annual profit last year since the 2007 financial crisis. Alexei Navalny has died in prison, according to Russia's prison service. The Scottish Government has published an action plan to tackle population decline in Scotland. And the drive to green energy is being fueled by renewable energy produced in Scotland. And to ensure the lights stay on in homes in the southeast of England, new interconnectors are being constructed to take the power from Scotland's wind farms and connect it to the UK's national grid in the north of England. So coming back to the Ukraine update on day 723 of Russia's war in Ukraine. US congressional delays of fresh military aid for Ukraine is already having an impact on the battlefield, NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has warned at a defence ministers' meeting. Jens Stoltenberg said he still believed Congress would eventually approve the stalled £50 billion package. Ukraine has said its economy should be rebuilt using frozen Russian assets after a report showed the cost of reconstruction increasing to almost $500 billion. An estimated $300 billion of Russian assets have been frozen since the war started. The EU, US, and Western allies are debating how they can be used to benefit Ukraine. Ukraine is conducting a maneuver in Avdiivka to withdraw troops in some areas to more advantageous positions, a military spokesman has said. At the same time, Ukraine has brought in reinforcements to the strategically important town, surrounded on 3 sides by Russian forces in what Ukraine's military has called an extremely critical situation. On Thursday, Ukraine said 4 people were killed in Kherson and Kharkiv following Russian air and missile attacks, while officials in the Russian border city of Belgorod said a Ukrainian rocket strike killed at least 7 people. France and Ukraine are due to sign a bilateral agreement on security today. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is set to visit France and Germany. UK Defence Secretary Grant Shapps said the UK would co-lead a major drone capability coalition with Latvia for Ukraine. Ukrainian military intelligence has ramped up claims that Russian troops in Ukraine are using Starlink satellite internet terminals. Lieutenant General Kirill Budanov said in the Wall Street Journal that the Russians had thousands of them and had been using them for quite a long time after buying them through other countries. An FBI informant has been charged with lying about ties between Joe Biden, his son Hunter, and a Ukrainian energy company. Prosecutors allege Alexander Smirnov falsely told FBI agents that executives associated with Burisma paid Hunter and Joe Biden $5 million each in 2015 and 2016. The development sharply undermines congressional Republicans' corruption accusations that the US president was making money from his son's business dealings in Ukraine. Moving back on to the latest in Israel and Gaza. 112 Palestinians have been killed and 157 were injured in Israeli strikes in the past 24 hours, said the Gaza Health Ministry. An exodus of Palestinians into Egypt must be avoided at all costs and could be the nail in the coffin of a future peace process, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, said on Friday. He said a spillover of refugees from Gaza into Egypt would be a disaster for the future of peace. I mean, Richard, what's your take on the critical situation that we find ourselves watching unfolding in Gaza with the border at Rafah? I mean, what's the talk in amongst your colleagues in Westminster about this?
Well, we've been off in recess back in our constituencies this week, so my contact with colleagues has been limited, but I don't think anyone would be surprised to know that we continue to be at the forefront of calls for an immediate ceasefire. It's quite obvious that the people of Gaza continue to suffer. The death toll continues to rise. There's a great concern at the military operations that continue there, and of the information that gets out of Gaza. So, in relation to IDF operations, so we're quite clear that an immediate ceasefire is what is required. All that humanitarian pauses all that they achieve is a temporary cessation of hostilities. People get their bellies filled a little bit again, and then the bombs start falling. And we've been clear from the outset, the only solution here is a political one. There's no military solution that can be enforced, and we'll continue to be at the forefront of these calls. And when we go back next week to Westminster, the SNP has an opposition day debate, and we will be again putting the issue of an immediate ceasefire to the fore in the House of Commons.
I mean, it looks as though Egypt is preparing an area near the border, but it doesn't look particularly hospitable. I mean, sort of footage from Google Maps indicates that it's going to be yet another kind of pretty much a sort of tented strip, very much enclosed. I mean, it's the whole issue about, I mean, the amount of people that will potentially be seeking refuge. I mean, are we seeing another Nakba? Is this, do you think, an intentional strategy from Israel, given Netanyahu and his far right government's talk about a greater Israel and sort of the talk about setting up settlements, Jewish settlements in Gaza?
I think some Israeli far-right politicians have said the quiet bit out loud and I think this is a danger, that if you start to see Gazans setting up camp in Egypt, then effectively that will be them removed from Gaza forever. And I do not doubt that in certain elements of the Israeli government that will indeed, or supporters of the Israeli government, that will indeed be a strategy. But this is not. The Gazans are not, the Palestinians are not a problem to be disposed of. The only way to resolve the tension that has blighted the Middle East and this part of the Middle East for so long is through a political solution. So I would worry very much about the symbolism, not about people being safe, obviously, but about the symbolism of large numbers of people from Gaza having to live outside their home. Their homes and their home area, because and outside the Gaza Strip as a result of the aggression that is being perpetrated at the moment by the Israeli government. I worry very much about that, but I have absolutely no doubt that there are elements supporting the Israeli government who would dearly like the symbolism of moving the Palestinians out of Gaza, but that will not be the end to the security problems there, and it will not bring about peace. The only way is a political solution which allows Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side in peace and prosperity and in dignity. And sadly, I see little chance of that coming about while Benjamin Netanyahu is the Prime Minister and while the coalition that he leads continues to hold on to power.
How significant do you think it is? I mean, the King of Jordan gave a fairly strongly worded speech in company of President Joe Biden earlier this week. You've got Western leaders, holding a round of meetings at the Munich Security Conference to try and put pressure on Israel, and yet, it was just reported today in sort of the Middle East Eye that energy firms face legal threats over Israeli licenses which have been issued to drill for gas off Gaza. That was done shortly after the Israelis invaded Gaza. So, yeah, I mean, they've been rights groups say exploration licenses handed to companies in the first weeks of the war encroach on Palestinian waters and may amount to the war crime of pillaging. And this comes at the same time that South Africa's going back to the International Court of Justice. And it's is Israel being an honest broker or an honest agent in any of this? I mean, obviously, yes, of course, murder of anybody is wrong. Of course, you can understand them wanting to have a response to Hamas, but their actions would perhaps suggest that there's more to this than going after some terrorists.
Well, you might say that. I'm not. You're obviously more up to speed on that particular development than I am. But look, I'm clear. An immediate ceasefire is what is required. The only solution is a political one. But quite frankly, the Israeli government is able to act as it does because it does not fear the consequences of acting in the manner in which it does. And I think that if anybody is serious about bringing this action to as quick a conclusion as can possibly be the case, then the thing to do is to stop arming Israel, to stop supporting their military, and that will, I can't think of anything else that can bring hostilities to a halt more quickly than that, because quite clearly the government of Israel does not fear the consequences of continuing to defy international opinion here.
How much traction do you think there will be for the SNP, their motion, the motion that you have put forward or will be putting forward to call for a ceasefire? I mean, there have been some of the, some within the perhaps sort of the more Labour sympathising or Conservative sympathising press who are saying that it's just gesture politics, because the UK can't do anything to make a ceasefire happen. Is there a legitimacy in that perspective?
No, I don't think there is, because you can lead by example, you can lead thought, you can lead opinion, you can communicate your distaste and show it, and say that, and show that example. If you did nothing in politics because there wasn't an immediate linkage between what you say and what you do and what the outcomes are, then we'd all be wasting our time, because frankly, so much of politics is about leadership and about leading opinion and about in the influence that you can exert, whether that's in terms of hard power or in case of soft power or influence. Now, in terms of traction, I wouldn't say traction for the SNP, but traction in the House of Commons. I know that there are a number of people, decent MPs on all parties, in the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, who have very grave reservations about the stance that their party leaderships respectively have taken on this. So yes, when that vote is held, I don't expect the vote to win, because people will be whipped heavily in the Conservative and Labour parties, particularly to oppose that SNP motion. I've no doubt there will also be attempts to try and amend that. But what I do think will happen is there will be a significant number of people will walk through the lobbies with the SNP in order precisely to show that distaste for what is happening, and and to demonstrate their support for a ceasefire as an act preparatory to the kind of political discussions that are the only way that are going to bring this to a resolution.
I mean, do you're you've got the brief for sort of international sort of trade and business. You obviously have a lot of international connections. I mean, you've got President Macron of France warning that the human cost of Israel's operation of Gaza is intolerable, and that Israel's offensive must cease. And yesterday, you've got the Prime Ministers of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand jointly backing calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. and even the German foreign minister Annalena Baerbock has warned that the people in Rafah have got to know where to go and cannot simply vanish into thin air. Do you detect that there is a shift perhaps in the global leadership, and do you think there's a risk that Westminster will be left on the wrong side of history?
I think subtly, yes, there has been a noticeable shift over the past few weeks. We've gone from asserting Israel's right to defend itself, which I don't think anyone really disputed, to now it's taken for granted in most sensible quarters that the action that has been taken by the Israeli government goes far, far beyond anything that is reasonable or proportionate in response. So now I think we are seeing governments being prepared to be more critical of the Israeli government. But I think it's one thing to pass motions and to make speeches or to answer questions in interviews. I think that what leaders have to do is to move towards a situation where direct pressure is put on the Israeli government to change its behaviour. And I think one of the ways, as I said earlier, that can happen is to make sure that we cease the supply of arms to Israel, because I have very much doubt that Israel is capable of sustaining that kind of military operation for too much longer, were it not for the support that it gets from its allies in military terms.
Well, moving on to news closer to home, Sir Keir Starmer has hailed Labour's fantastic results in the Kingswood and Wellingborough by-elections after the party secured two victories that suggest it is on course for a majority at the general election this year. The Labour leader said the gain of two relatively safe Conservative seats showed voters wanted change and trusted his party to deliver it. And the Labour Party secured a near record swing of 28.5 percentage points in Wellingborough and a more modest one of 16.4 points in Kingswood, both of which would give them a secure majority if repeated at a national vote. The swing in Wellingborough, where 28-year-old Jen Kitchen overturned a Conservative majority of 18,000, would be enough, if repeated as a general election, to see the Tories win just 4 seats. It is Labour's biggest swing from the Tories since 1994 and the second biggest since the war. And do you think, Richard, that the polls kind of come and go, don't they? A wee bit. There was polling just a couple of days ago saying, Labour might, their lead is slipping, but this looks pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, I mean, I think, with all the usual caveats about midterm unpopularity and that governments tend not to win by elections midterm, I think we can take all of that for granted. But nevertheless, I think there's still a scale to these results, that they are of a historic significance in terms of the size of the swing. But what my gut instinct around this is that, never mind the fact that neither by-election came around in the manner the Conservatives would have wanted. Well, they never do. It's a truism, but it seems to me that the Conservatives are deeply, deeply unpopular in what were formerly their heartlands in England, and there is nothing that Rishi Sunak is going to be able to say or to do that changes that. And I think that you can see that sense almost of despair bordering on, or resignation bordering on despair, creeping through the Tory ranks. There's just been a capillary action of that over the last few weeks. It's been visible at Westminster. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the Labour Party are popular, or that Keir Starmer is popular, or that people necessarily like or trust them. And I think that, it's a nailed-on certainty that the Conservatives are going to lose the next election at UK level. I think it's as pretty much a nailed-on certainty as you can get that Labour will win. I think the extent of that victory is still something to be determined. But I don't think people are voting Labour with any great sense of purpose, of expectation, or in any kind of knowledge about what it is that they stand for. And we saw that last week with the abandonment of their £28 billion investment in green energy pledge. That was their only noticeable, discernible policy priority for the next term or for their first term of government if they got into government. And they've dropped it because they were so terrified of the attack lines that were coming from the Tories, a Tory party which, as we saw, just folded and barely even contested these by-elections, either in terms of the ground operation or in terms of the number of votes that came out of that. So I think that there's much for Labour to be concerned about, but certainly I think that in terms of how well they may do when the general election comes along, in terms of what kind of actual moral political mandate they will have for anything that they might wish to do, that I think that the era of offering as little of a target to the Conservatives as possible in the hope that they won't upset anyone, I think that is running out of road quite rapidly. So they shouldn't get too carried away with these results. But I think what it does show is that this is a terminal case for the Conservatives, and it's now a matter of when they're out of office rather than if at Westminster level, which of course then opens up the question of who in that situation is it that Scots want to have representing them? Who best represents the values of Scottish people, the political values that they would want to see represented, whether that's in terms of the economy, in terms of dealing with the cost of living crisis, in terms of social security, in terms of the stance that we take on the great issues of the day in the wider world. And I think that when you've got somebody like Anna Sarwar saying that he will stand up, the Scottish Labour leader will stand up to the British Labour leader to defend Scotland, I think it just shows how hollow the prospectus is that the Labour Party still offers, whether that's in Scotland or at the UK level as a whole.
It is fairly striking that Anna Sarwar has said a few times that he would stand up to Keir Starmer, but that there's never seems to be any evidence of that. And certainly the new Labour MP, is it Michael Shanks MP, went with the whip and voted exactly as Sir Keir Starmer told him to, rather than Anna Sarwar from his branch office in Glasgow. But Alison Thewlis MP has said that Anna Sarwar, has had committed an astonishing own goal when he claimed that Labour government in Scotland would reform tax in the NHS. Basically, he's been told that he can't do that now, I'm sure. And Alison Thewlis went on to say that it's voting SNP is vital to stand up for Scotland's values and right to choose. And the same week that Anna Sarwar has said that he would not allow an independence referendum for Scotland. But is there not an own goal that the SNP, or an open goal the SNP is missing spectacularly? The latest party political broadcast is coming for some criticism. The SNP's one is coming for some criticism because First Minister Humza Yousaf doesn't mention independence once. Surely the SNP has to come up with a very clear message, because if people are looking for change, they may just go, well, the SNP is what we know have had for many years now. Labour represent change. What is it? Surely the only change that you can offer them is independence, and if that's not coming through front and centre, what's the point? What's the point of voting for the SNP if that's not clear?
Well, I think that we have to be very careful of the word counters for independence tendency. I remember an illustrative example. One of my followers on social media criticised me for putting out a newsletter, and they said, "No mention of independence, Richard." And I said, "Well, no, not except for the appearance in there on BBC One, where I'm literally talking about independence." So independence is woven through pretty much all that we do. We sometimes take examples that illustrate why Scotland would be better off if we had control over powers at Westminster, why it would be better. The energy debate is a case in point about why it would be better if we were not having to rely on Westminster taking the right decisions, and if we were simply able to take the right decisions for ourselves off the back of the mandate of people that we elect. So there are all sorts of different ways to make the case for independence. But I think at this election, it's quite clear that we need to find a route there. Now, there is no magic way that we can somehow leap to independence and with a bound Scotland is free. There is no way to independence without a majority of Scots being in favour of it. And we're pretty well, it's nip and tuck there at the moment. But I always think that the most illustrative example of what we can look at elsewhere comes through the Good Friday Agreement. Now, part of my portfolio is also to speak on Northern Irish affairs for the SNP, since we're the third party currently at Westminster and we need somebody to do that. Now, if you look back to the Good Friday Agreement, it's written in there that if it looks like to the Secretary of State, and I don't care for the fact it's the Secretary of State, I don't care for that language, if it looks likely to them that a majority would vote in favour of a united Ireland, then they will make provision for such a vote to take place. I think that the Supreme Court took a very, very narrow judgment on the rights of the Scottish Parliament to hold a referendum. Perhaps the Supreme Court, chaired by Lady Hale, would have come to a different conclusion, but that's the situation we're in. So I very much think that the only way we get to independence is by building support for it, and there's no shortcut to that. It's through patient argument. Sometimes it's about simply making the case with the issues that come up day by day, in terms of building up that support to a level where the case for a vote on Scottish independence becomes absolutely unanswerable. Now, I think there are many problems with trying to do that through a plebiscite election, but nevertheless, I look forward to going out and campaigning and making the case, as I always have done, for why the best people to run Scotland are those who've chosen to make their lives here, and why we could reach a range of better outcomes if only we were in control of these matters, where we're constrained only by the limits of our own choices, resources, imaginations and decisions, and by constraints that are placed on us by no other electoral decisions taken anywhere else.
And is that getting a response on the doors when you're going around?
Yes, it does, because I go out and I engage with people on their level, and that's the only way you can get it. I mean, I could go around and shout through a loudhailer about why Scotland should be independent and stir up mass indifference to that, or you can meet people where they are. And sometimes it's great when you meet the large numbers of people who already do support independence, but, let's not kid ourselves. There's folk out there yet to be convinced. But they do like the idea of having that strong Scottish voice in any situation at Westminster, in a situation short of independence. But fundamentally, you've got to meet these people where they are and try and bring them closer to where we would wish them to be in terms of accepting the arguments about self-government. So, yes, it is about that painstaking discussions and making sure that you're going out and having those discussions with people, and, as I say, meeting them where they are in the hope that they will begin to accept or begin to understand a little better why you argue for the independence that you do, and why it might actually be in their interest to support that also.
Well, moving on to matters fiscal, NatWest has made its biggest annual profit last year since the 2007 financial crisis, helped by high interest rates, as the bank confirmed the interim boss, Paul Thwaite, would permanently take over as its chief executive before a public sale of its government-owned shares. The bank, which was formerly known as the RBS Group and is still 35% UK government-owned, said pre-tax profits rose 20% to $6.2 billion in the year to December. That is higher than the analyst forecast for $6 billion and marks its largest annual profit recorded since it made $10 billion in 2007. The year before, excesses led to a $45.5 billion public rescue that is yet to be fully unwound 16 years later. Bumper profits in 2023 came as the bank made more money from loans and mortgages compared to what it paid savers after another year of interest rate increases by the Bank of England. Those earnings, known as net interest income, rose 12% to £11 billion. It sent NatWest shares up more than 5%, making it the biggest riser on the FTSE 100. Shareholders will receive a £1 billion payout with a final dividend worth 11.5 pence a share, and have a chance to take part in a 300 million share buyback programme. The earnings result will set a high benchmark for Thwaite, who NatWest confirmed on Friday will take over permanently as chief executive with immediate effect, running the bank alongside incoming chair Richard Haythorne-Thwaite. Thwaite's appointment will help pave the way for UK government plans to sell shares in NatWest to the general public later this year, after the state agency that manages the taxpayer stake said the market needed reassurance on NatWest's leadership before going ahead. And Richard, it's one of those one of these stories that on the one hand, yep, that sounds like a great thing. On the other hand, yep, selling to the public, that sounds great. But should it not be the case that these Westminster government shares are retained, and is there not an argument that that rather than these shares be sold to the general public, given that everybody currently owns the 30%, 35% share of it through the government-owned shares, that perhaps there should be greater investment back in providing a service for people? What's your view on banks and that
Well,
have
I would
government
tend,
ownership?
I would tend to the view that there are things government should be investing in, and the banks wouldn't ordinarily be one of them. But I think my great disappointment is that with this amount of shareholding and therefore control over the banks, we've seen such a retrenchment and a move away from community banking, where we've seen so many bank branch closures. And we've seen more and more customers being pushed online. So I think that you could certainly have a more activist government in terms of directing how the banking system works like that. Actually, I would rather see the government do that anyway. But I don't think the government needs to, because it's the government, I don't think it necessarily needs shares in order to do that. And if there's a choice between holding several £billion worth of shares in banks, given how much the taxpayer had to put in to bail the banks out, I would want to see the taxpayer in the round getting fair value back for that. But also, what I would like to see is government increasing the amount that it's willing to invest. So if it can divest itself of holdings in banks and put that to good use elsewhere, for example, into renewable energy, I'm sure we could. It wouldn't take long to make that kind of transaction and investment. I think there are other areas of the economy where government can and should be taking a lead in terms of galvanising investment. And I'm not saying it's necessarily an either or, but there are some things I don't think government should necessarily be in. And I think that if you're regulating the market effectively and you're regulating the operation of the banks effectively, you don't need a big shareholding in banks to also do that. And that's capital that could perhaps be put to better use elsewhere in the economy for the benefit of a greater number of people.
I mean, what's your view on, for example, the future of an independent Scotland's banking sector or other sectors? Are you of the view that a nationalised infrastructure or should, as a point of national security, certain institutions be owned by the state and the people of that state, rather than relying entirely on market forces and sort of capitalism as being king?
Are you asking me if I'm in favour of public ownership of certain assets?
Yes.
Yes, I am. I believe that the railways should be in public ownership, and I'm pleased that they are. And certainly in an independent Scotland, I see no justification for that not being the case. I think there are certain things that the state is uniquely placed to do, and I'm sure I could come up with other examples whereby the state either having outright ownership or taking a key share is important in ensuring not just security, but also in terms of ensuring good productivity. So there are some things that the state should do. We expect that the state should run our health service. We expect that there are things that we expect our local authorities to do. There are things that we expect our central government to do. Because it's right that the risks and the rewards in that are shared out equally amongst the tax base, and also because we simply think that these are areas where the profit motive is not appropriate. And there's some other things like public services, like, as I say, the railways, where and also I would say, obviously you would want to keep CalMac in public ownership as well. You want to keep water in public ownership. These are things where I think that the case is very well made, and in an independent Scotland, I certainly wouldn't want to be seeing that change in any way.
And what about gas? I mean, the gas, British Gas declared tenfold profits. I mean, as people are sitting cold in their houses because they can't afford to pay their bills. Do you think that that there should be
I
public
don't think
ownership
you
of
don't.
energy?
If the state could own the company, but it's not going to change the wholesale price of gas. Now, I think I would like to see the state take a key role in rolling out Scotland's renewables potential. But the state also has the power to tax excess profits, and where profits are being made that are excessive and not down to and are simply down to exogenous circumstances, as we've seen with the war in Ukraine, then the state shouldn't be afraid to act in terms of diverting those profits to more socially useful purposes.
Well, moving back to Eastern Europe, Alexei Navalny has died in prison, Russia's prison service announced today. Supporters of Navalny and Western officials have called it a political assassination, which has been attributable to President Vladimir Putin. The 47-year-old Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, has been one of Putin's most visible and persistent critics. He was being held in jail about 40 miles north of the Arctic Circle, where he'd been sentenced to 19 years under a special regime. Western reaction was swift as top officials from the US and Europe accused the Kremlin of causing Navalny's death. His death in a Russian prison and the fixation and fear of one man only underscores the weakness and rot at the heart of the system that Putin has built, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said. Russia is responsible for this. Navalny's family and friends said they were still trying to confirm his death independently. Speaking at the Munich Security Conference, his wife Yulia said, "I don't know whether to believe the terrible news that we've received only from official media. We cannot believe Putin and his government. But if it is true, then I would like Putin, his staff, his friends, his government to know that they will be punished for what they have done to our country, my family, and my husband. They will be brought to justice, and that day will come very soon." Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said it was obvious that Putin was behind Navalny's death, and German Finance Minister Christian Lindner said Alexei Navalny fought for democratic Russia. For that, Putin tortured him to death. I mean, looking at the track record of President Vladimir Putin, is the critics and opponents seem to sort of die from poisoning and defenestration quite with sort of remarkable frequency. What is your view on the state of Russian democracy, and do you have any insight into what the people of Russia will make of this?
No special insight any more than you might have yourself, Ruth. But no, I mean it's quite clear, as you say, that anyone who crosses Vladimir Putin usually is not long for this earth, whether that's falling out of windows or aircraft falling out of the sky or being poisoned. He just comes across as a very, very scared man who knows his time is running out. His health would, there's much speculation about his personal state of health. Certainly, he doesn't look to be somebody who is in good shape and in the best of health, but he is somebody who needs war, who needs that conflict, who needs to keep driving on in those spheres in order to retain power. And I think, he is quite an old man now, and I think he will be very, very worried of those with the hungry glint in their eye who are looking as to who might replace him, and looking to the day where he is no longer in that position of power in the Kremlin. But for all that it's easy to say that, he could be there for quite some time yet, and we should always beware of what might replace him. But certainly, the state of Russian democracy, there is no democracy. There has been no democracy for some time. Elections are simply a piece of performance art. It's simply something that goes on for show. Nobody is allowed to emerge who can seriously challenge him, and if they do, then, as you say, they usually meet a pretty grisly end one way or another. And I don't think that Putin and his hench people even care any longer whether anyone actually believes what they say, whether that's in their own media, which they, of course, control heavily, or at the United Nations. They're so used to lying and constructing their own reality. I don't think many people in Russia are any longer taken in by that, but there is I think there is a certain fatalism amongst the Russian people that this is how it is, and it's how it's going to be until it is no longer how it is. But the idea that individuals might be able to affect a political change as we might expect to be able to do through the ballot box, I think is illusory. And Russia remains a very dark, dangerous, and for those who of independent mind, frightening place at the moment.
I mean, Alexei Navalny showed remarkable courage and principle in many of the sort of political positions that he adopted over the years, and his consistent standing up to Vladimir Putin. What do you think it was about Alexei Navalny that intimidated the regime so much? He is indeed just one man.
I think that the regime is intimidated by anyone who is credible and who is an articulate critic of theirs. They're because they fear that such sentiments, such criticisms might gain traction and might lead to the revolution coming that they clearly fear. Now, we saw with the revolutions in 1980, in 1988, you could see the economic difficulties that was looming in Eastern Europe. I don't think anyone necessarily foresaw what would happen across, towards the end of 1989 with the revolutions that swept Eastern Europe. So things can look like they're not going to move and then move very quickly. But I think fundamentally the thing about Navalny that terrified Putin is the same thing that terrifies all dictators, is that there's somebody who is prepared to say the emperor has no clothes. It's somebody who is prepared to be an intelligent, honest, articulate, fearless critic. And those who show no fear must be done away with in the view of people like Putin, in order to maintain that grip of fear that they have over the rest of the population. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think those are, in essence, people who make that stance and who get a platform and who are listened to, instantly by their nature become a threat, because they they present the kryptonite, if you like, to the alternative reality that Putin needs people to, if not agree with, and at least if not accept, and at least tolerate, in order to remain in power.
And do you think there's a chance that, sort of looking at the tea leaves of what's happening within the Russian Federation, that perhaps the Putin's grasp is slipping? I mean, there were highly unusual demonstrations that went on for several days in the grip of winter in the northeast of the country. You've got several of the federations of the countries within the federation who sort of refused Putin the help and troops that he had expected to be sent to Ukraine. Do you think that cracks are beginning to show, or in this election year in particular, that's kind of bad PR for Putin? Or do you think that he will just double down and sort of...
I think he'll be very careful not to double down where he does not have the power to do so. He's not somebody who clearly lashes out immediately when defied, although it clearly he's always looking at what his next moves might be and how he can play a longer game to eliminate opponents. But I think you could argue that some cracks are beginning to show. But I think the thing is that when the thing that he will fear most is people no longer fearing him. And you saw that with the with the Wagner Group march on Moscow, which stopped there. Now, you might say, as an armchair general, if you take the view, if you're going for the king, you'd better not miss. And I think if you're going to mount an insurrection, then go and do it properly. You don't just stop 150 miles or so from Moscow and then accept Vladimir Putin's word that you'll be well looked after in Belarus, because exactly what happened was a month or so later the plane fell out of the sky and the leader of the aborted putsch was dead in the smouldering wreckage. So yeah, I think that when the fear goes, that is what Putin fears most, and he will do everything that he can to maintain that as long as he can. But also, he is not somebody who necessarily always reacts precipitately to things like that. He wants to make sure that he has his forces balanced behind him, and he understands the dynamics of power and people's psychology quite well, I think, and he will be always looking to see how he can calibrate things to keep his position as strong as it ever can be in the long run. But I think that the more that people are able to, and institutions are able to defy him, if you like, without there being a consequence. Perhaps the flip side of that is the more emboldened other individuals or institutions may become, and which could ultimately lead to his departure from office.
Which indeed some may argue is why perhaps Alexei Navalny posed such a threat, and maybe the reason why he's allegedly no longer alive. Putin sending another message. Moving back to Scotland and Scottish news, the Scottish Government has published a wide-ranging action plan to strengthen communities facing population decline, including funding for local red research, initiatives and community support, has been published by the Scottish Government today. Projections showing that Scotland's population is set to fall from 2033, with 14 local authority areas projected to experience population decline over the next decade. The Addressing Depopulation Action Plan will set out the Scottish Government's strategy to support people to live, work and raise family in the places affected, many of which are rural and island areas. A £180,000 Addressing Depopulation Fund will initially help 3 acutely affected local authorities trial ways of retaining and attracting people to their communities. The projects to receive funds will be announced later this year. Part funding has been provided this financial year by the Scottish Government for community settlement officers in Argyll and Bute, Highland and Comerna Ilinsar, enabling them to continue supporting people living in or moving to those areas. Part funding for these roles has also been put forward for the next financial year, as well as support for a community settlement officer to be established in Inverclyde. The Increase in Galloway Council will receive £30,000 to research the causes of local population decline to inform the development of future policy interventions. I mean, Emma Ruddock, the migration minister, launched, and a Scottish MSP launched this plan at the Nevis Centre in Fort William earlier today. But I mean, could it not be said, Richard, that one of the biggest causes of population decline is a lack of affordable housing within people's communities?
Yes, of course it could. That's a key part of it. I think it's about having economic opportunity in the round, and communities being able to be welcoming places. I mean, we see in parts of Aberdeenshire some of the pressures that there are simply because of a lack of affordable housing. Now, if that means that there is an exodus of young, talented people who have to move to where they can get affordable housing, then that means that that means that businesses lose opportunities. It means that it's harder to fill positions in the public sector, and it means that communities lose their vitality and become at risk of the depopulation of the kind that this paper is designed to help tackle. So there is no one single silver bullet that will solve the population problem in Scotland, or the rural depopulation problem in areas which are thought to be under threat of that. But certainly housing, affordable housing and suitable housing is a very, very big part of that, and can also act, I would argue, as a driver for pulling people, not just stemming the outflow of population, but also attracting young families to move back to areas and to build their lives there, and therefore, keep the shops going, keep the local school going, and to add the vitality that every community, and wherever it is, needs in order to be thriving and welcoming.
I mean, surely also there's a real issue where you've got the Gaeltacht and you've got sort of culture, language. I mean, Doric up in the northeast, and if communities, if people and families can't either stay and make their homes where they've been raised, or come back after they're coming back from university to have real opportunities, for example, then I mean, surely the Scottish Government is failing in its duty to help people have a normal family life if they can't live near their family. And I mean, this also is being repeated in many ways around the world with the rise of Airbnb. I mean, what do you think the solution is? I mean, is it a question of, you know, having a limit on the number of properties an individual or an organisation can own in Scotland, so that we don't just become this great big sort of, holiday village?
Well, I've already said that I think housing is part of it, but there's no one silver bullet. There's a whole range of things that make places attractive to live. And look, I mean, tourism is an important part of our economy. I'm not going to take a downer on tourism because it does support jobs, but it's about the balance that there is there. And there are some villages where, or even if you go to the new town in Edinburgh, for example, the old town in Edinburgh, you can see entire closes where there's the little key safes for the Airbnbs where once people lived and raised their families. So I think that the licensing scheme is key to that. I think the Scottish Government was absolutely right to ignore some of the squeals of self-interest that came in round about that. So I think it's about making sure that there is always that balance, and that difficult to do when you're having your capital budget cut by 10% by Westminster. Useful to point that out as an example for why independence would be better, because we could set our own capital budgets, incidentally. But that kind of ties the hands of a devolved government in terms of what it can do. Now, the Scottish Government has delivered a large number of new houses for whether council houses or affordable houses for rent, and also mixed tenure houses. So the Scottish Government's got a record I think it can point to with some justification that is being quite a good record on that, albeit there is always a need to build more houses. But we need to remember that communities are living, breathing, thriving things. They are not little picture postcards to be preserved in aspic as they always were. We need to be making the space for people to live, and that's not to suburbanise the countryside or anything like it, but it is to make sure that those who want the opportunity to make their lives in the communities where they grew up are able to do so. Or where they don't and they want to spread their wings and go elsewhere, where there is room for those with vitality can move in and live affordably and live well, in order to provide the kind of services and the jobs and to fulfil the duties that communities need of them. So I think that housing is a very, very important part of this, but there's so much else there round about connectivity, round about infrastructure, and about well-funded public services, and making sure that we're reversing what many see as the kind of drain of rural function towards more centralised institutions, whether that's banks retreating, whether it's post offices closing. It's about resisting that tendency to centralise always, and understanding that rural communities need that function in order to maintain their vitality, and doing everything that government can in terms of the way it delivers public services and the way it invests in infrastructure, and particularly in housing, to make sure that those are viable places, both now and going into the future.
So, I mean, you touched upon the centralisation issue. It's I mean, surely the issue of centralisation is a pretty crucial one. I mean, we've got the drive to green energy is being fueled by renewable energy produced in Scotland, and to ensure that the lights stay on in homes in the southeast of England. But I mean, this infrastructure, there's very much a sense, for example, among people in the northeast who are facing these mega pylons, that Edinburgh is so far away, where the council, the government there isn't listening to people in the rural areas. That our countryside is about to be sacrificed under the altar of mega pylons, by a government that's actually a bit remote in Edinburgh, that just wants the power and doesn't really care
Well,
about the
sorry,
lives
there's
of
a couple of
people.
things I'm going to need to. There's a couple of things there, Ruth, that just aren't accurate. One, the Scottish Government is not responsible for pylons, mega or otherwise. Through the Electricity Act, the companies have, SSEN has the ability to move forward with planning applications as it does, and it's not, that's a reserved matter as well. But I think there's a point that if people do feel remote, it's about how you can reconnect them to the decision making process, and I find that there's a very self-serving narrative at work in certain parts of Scottish discourse that somehow Holyrood is remote, but Westminster isn't. Now, where I, Edinburgh is, 2 hours away from Aberdeenshire. If you want to go and lobby your parliamentarians, it's a damn sight easier to go and lobby Holyrood than it ever is to go and lobby in Westminster. But, I think that in terms of centralisation, it's something that companies do when they reduce their footprints. For example, banks, when they reduce their footprints there. It's something that Ofcom is determined to try and allow the Royal Mail to do by proposing that mail deliveries could be cut to 3 mail deliveries a week, something I challenged the Prime Minister on in Westminster a few weeks ago at Prime Minister's Questions. So I think that we have to show that the Scottish Government has got a good record of investing in rural areas, but we need to understand that there are forces that are very big economic forces out there that are, if they're not quite beyond the control of governments, it means that governments do have to change the way that they react to that in order to allow people to live the kind of lives that they would want. And, certainly I'm never going to apologise for wanting to harness the renewables potential in Scotland because, quite frankly, we could set a good example to the world in that. And, we don't need to be building nuclear power stations to power the southeast of England, and they're very welcome to go and build them in England if that's what they want to do. But nevertheless, there are there are things that the government has been doing that are good in Scotland that I don't think would be happening if we didn't have that devolved government. But again, it comes back to, if you want to start taking some of the bigger decisions that are there, rather than simply deciding how the cake gets sliced up, that does require more powers than the Scottish Government has at the present time. And for me, in the discussions I go out and have on the doorsteps with people, that's a key selling factor in terms of why Scotland should be independent and why it would be better if we did have all of these powers to set the parameters of the debate more widely than they can ever be set when so many powers are held elsewhere.
Well, obviously, as a reserved matter, the decisions about energy generation and distribution are taken at Westminster through the regulator Ofgem. But Councillor Derek Loudon yesterday, the councillor for Tane and Easter Ross, just a wee bit further north than you, made the point very clearly on a BBC Scotland phone-in yesterday that that none of the income from energy production comes back to Scotland. And under the current national transmission plan being devised by the National Grid, sort of intended to be published in time for the UK government's March budget, these mega pylons sort of seem to be a big part of that, and yet there's no guarantee. This is quite speculative. There's no guarantee that this project will actually end up with the power being used in the north of England as intended. They may, we may end up losing our countryside and having to no avail, so that it can sort of benefit the south of England. Where you're at, what's the view both on the issue of wind farms and generation and a just transition within both the
if we don't have renewables, there's nothing to transition to. That might sound trite, but it's blind. It's obvious. Now, I think that there's a legitimate argument. I don't see it as Scotland is still getting about 75% of its energy met by fossil fuels, as is the rest of the world. So there's much that we can do to use electricity generated in Scotland to decarbonise our industry, for example, to decarbonise home heating, to electrify transport. So there's a lot that we would be using domestically that we need to go out and generate for ourselves. But I think there is a legitimate argument that some areas more than most will be bearing the brunt of the infrastructure that goes in. And I think there's a legitimate debate to be had about how you get legitimate community benefit out of that. Now, that is something that we're not going to get under the present regime. We're not going to get it out of Ofgem because that's not their remit as they see it. So I think there's legitimate arguments there, how Scotland as a whole and how communities in particular can get more of a benefit from that mission. But it's inevitable that the areas which have the greatest renewables potential are possibly also those areas currently with the least demand. And where that's the case, you have to transport it somehow. Now, there's no cost-free option in terms of how you do that. It's certainly cheaper to the companies to transport it over land on pylons, but certainly cable technology has advanced a great deal, and it's now possible to lay direct current cables which can carry large amounts of electricity a long distance without that visual impact. It's a lot more expensive, but we're also talking about vast amounts of energies over extended periods of time, and certainly it's not out with the economics of these projects and the economics of what we need to do to save the planet to have
Well,
more
on that
running in that way.
planet saving note, I will stop you there because we're running out of time. We've powered through the evening, and we're now coming to that end of the programme. That's it for this evening. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on our supporters' generosity to donate and keep us going. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Thank you very much to my guest, Richard Thomson. My name's Ruth Watson. Good night.